So here we are on the final community development portal sync with the current team in 2021. And our lead engineer, Rejon, is going to take us through the architecture, a talk nerdy to me explanation of how things go. Really looking forward to it. So take it away, friend.
Thank you. Let me share my screen with you and start the typical rigmarole. Hello, everybody. Everybody on YouTube. My name is Rejon, and I also go by Maximum Crash in the community, but essentially, Tim put it the perfect way. I've been the lead developer on the Portal project since April of 2020. We are here. We've made it one whole year since we started development. And I'm kind of just going to fly through these slides. They are available for a much longer call at this YouTube video, this YouTube community call. Let me throw this in the chat real quick for y'all. Chat, bada bing, bada boom. So if you want to see the rest of these slides, you can definitely go through it. But essentially, to start off with our agenda, the first is really just talking about where we started and why we made some of the decisions that we made for the project when we started. Initially, there was the stakeholders for the portal were Tim, Amy, and Rich, who is no longer with the community, but he's still around in his ghostly ways. And essentially, the cry for help was that the initial portal that they had previously, I believe, was running Git books on GitHub, and it was very crunchy to work with. It didn't really do everything that everybody wanted. There was a little bit of a learning curve to being able to get started with Git books, especially given that a number of folks in our community aren't developers. So essentially, the need was to make a better Git books, give us a platform or a area in which we can grow and work together. So some of the mission objectives initially was to leverage a framework, if one existed, that essentially enables folks to create content, to write, to design new elements, make videos, and then have a collective place to then share that. Given that the MakerDAO community is global, we also need to be able to solve for localization and also making the platform accessible for our localizers as well. The directory of content needed to be decoupled. This was a very big request from Rich initially. They hated the folder structure for Git books. It was very unintuitive. And my approach is essentially to kind of lessen the amount of time it takes to solve a typo, right? Like the amount of time from somebody seeing a typo on our website and going, oh crap, somebody spelt the word worm wrong. And now we have to fix it. All of our developers are asleep because it is, I don't know, probably like 10 a.m. here in South Africa. Everybody is asleep. How do I fix this? How do I have the agency to be able to solve a problem when I see it? So that really was a very, very big ask for this kind of project. But the next big one was we need to be able to allow our writers to have access to any tools that they want, any. That means any components. If they want to put a heat map on the website, they should be able to. Without any really strict limitations other than the tediousness of implementing something like that. And then the last one was transferring the old content should be a snap, right? Like we don't want to lose any of the content that folks have already written because there's a lot of pages, hundreds of pages already existing on the Git books. So the ask was big, right? They want something that's easy to use, but this is something that is also extremely difficult to execute because there isn't really a CMS that is 100% free that will do this for any team, especially a global one like the MakerDAO community. So we kind of started off kind of designing what a dream CMS would look like, essentially giving our writers the agency to create the content they want without the need to really reach out to any developer like, hey, I wrote this thing wrong, how do I do it, right? Because not everybody's going to be available all the time. We also wanted to make sure that there was, solving for that amount of time to fix a typo situation, where the barrier of entry for new folks joining our community was extremely low, but also making sure that we could make the new system adoptable by the existing writers was very important. So with that in mind, Gitbooks was written mostly using Markdown, which was a really, really big, I want to say, advantage for us moving forward, because right around the same time we were doing a little bit of research and development for this dream CMS, we came to discover a number of really good technologies that just happened to work really, really well together if we could make them work well together. And then using these technologies to essentially establish a philosophy for how folks will work together in our community. So some of those, so our stack looks like this. GitHub acts as the source of truth, kind of where everything will start and end. Then we have Gatsby Js as our underlying React framework. The beautiful thing for me with Gatsby is that it has really, really good document querying using their GraphQL engine, I think, which might be built off of Sift. I could be wrong, but at the time of this conversation here, YouTube, Gatsby has launched version 3 of their framework, and our current stack is built using Gatsby version 2. So I'm not entirely sure what the upgrade process will look like for that. It might be a little bit crunchy, but lo and behold, if they made it, I imagine that the updates that they've made to the Gatsby framework alleviates some of the next, I want to say, rusty bits of Gatsby that I have with our project, but I'll get to that a little bit later. The next we have is Dai UI, which was built by the internal MakerDAO developer experience team. And essentially they were leveraging theme UI, and they have their own theme to kind of collectivize the design philosophies of the DAO and its community, beautifully designed by Shay on the call here with us today. And the underlying bits of theme UI is emotion.sh. And at the end of the day, it's really just like our means of applying styles with CSS and JS practices. Next is the bread and butter of the whole markdown conversion conversation, which is Mdx.js or Mdxjs. And it's kind of the heart of our engine. It essentially enables us to write our website using Markdown. But the beautiful part of it is that it allows us to interweave Markdown with React components. And when we start talking about being able to enable our writers to write code, we start to dip into the biggest philosophy behind the portal moving forward. But that's the next step. I don't want to, I'm just teasing y'all for a little bit. Some of the boring stuff here, which is also equally exciting, is we are using Lunar.js for our static search indexing. Typically, you could use something like Algolia, but in this case, we got to keep in mind we want things to stay free, and that means having our search index also be part of the build process for the website. And lastly, I built a custom translation module to kind of support the flexibility needed by the localization teams here at the community. And you might think I'm crazy for building my own translation module, given that there are many, many solutions to this, and I may have reinvented the wheel, but essentially by building our own translation module, we are given the flexibility to change it to meet our needs rather than changing our content to meet its needs. So yeah, it solves for a lot of things, right? This stack in particular, it's, We get directory interfacing in the code through Gatsby GraphQL API, which essentially solves for the I want a super simple, easy to read directory where my content goes, kind of enabling us to create a what you see is what you get kind of structure. So if anybody's like, I need this file from this page, you can look at the URL and the URL will directly match the directory structure that we would see in your code editor or any editor that you're using comfortably. GitHub serving as the source of truth solves, naturally not only source control for the project, but it also enables communication. And we have a couple of things designed on the community portal in particular to enable these conversations around the work that's being done. In particular, personally, I don't really like when folks will just write code and submit it, and then I may not know, I may not notice, and nobody on the team knows, and the person who did it will forget. So essentially, we have a little bit of DevOps, I call more of a GitOps process for enabling these conversations where we have certain branch permissions naturally combined with PR reviews. At least one human must see it. And then we have a couple of apps added. We have the good old Dependabot. We are using Kodiak for PR queues. And we are also using, excuse me, a little GitHub action called Pool Party Deploy, which is just another custom script that I put together for essentially stopping pool parties from happening in your code and your content. And you might see it on our repo called a lifeguard, but essentially they're the same thing. Finally, we have kind of the last two technologies, which is DieUI, which enables really good design bridge of communication between the community and the MakerDAO Foundation, which at the time, we were kind of a little bit more split than we are now. And the foundation had its own design team and its own kind of philosophies. And then, we had our own designers here in the community designing for the portal and designing for other projects. But essentially, DieUI is meant to solve those communication issues and making sure that everybody knows what our design philosophies are, from a technical standpoint, not an actual design standpoint. And then finally, MDX. I can't really gloat about it enough. It's a wonderful technology, and I believe it may be the future of writing websites in the future. But the most important part about MDX is that it enables a specific kind of practice or an underlying little secret thing I was kind of enabling and pushing on to our writers, where everybody wants more control, but not everybody wants to maintain the systems that require that control. Using Mdxjs enables us to kind of push this philosophy of architecture for the website versus how it's executed. And the TLDR there is I would essentially tell the team all summer that I'm not writing the website, you are, because we would essentially create this stack. The developers at the time, it was me, Isaac Pearl, and Elijah. And that was probably June or July. In August, I want to say, during our first phase. But we were more so tools developers than we were just front-end developers. And I think that distinction is super important, because what ends up happening is your content creators and your writers and your designers become engineers over time through the means of creating content for the website. However, naturally, with any stack, no stack is forever. Gatsby is not forever, right? They came out with a new version just as we're getting ready to sign off. And we had to essentially make sure that by using MDX combined with the React interlacing with Markdown, we can sort of kind of almost ensure that our content doesn't become locked into any hard framework. That means if there comes a day where the team wants to move away from Gatsby or move away from MDX, all you would have to do is run a little bit of a regex pattern and get rid of all the React code and just keep the markdown, and you're good to go. So the minimum requirements there is that like Markdown acts as our anchor point for our entire architecture. If there's no Markdown, there's no website, unfortunately. Let me skip ahead a little bit. Right, the secret sauce. So the secret sauce for the website was really just me and the rest of the stakeholders essentially creating this little silent on-ramp for turning writers into web developers. That means almost every single person that has actually worked on our website, that has contributed to our website, is also a junior front-end engineer to some extent. The more a writer would want out of the MDX system, the more knowledge they gained with React or with JavaScript. It's like, oh, I want this component to do X, Y, and Z. Well, you can make it. The same code you've been writing for the website is the same code we would use to create your components, give or take. And, you know, I think that this philosophy was proven super heavily when our designer, Shay, was able to go into our system and change some of the CSS parameters and make a commit, and everything went through clean. So if that doesn't really, you know, prove the chef's kiss and, you know, if it doesn't prove that we've got the really good secret sauce in the pudding here with this system, I don't know what is, especially when, you know, your designer is comfortable going into code and changing the things they want to change and getting what they want out of that. That's like perfecto. So yeah, I can talk about this for hours, at least in our philosophy, but I think we should definitely start moving on to some of the more super admin related stuff, get a little bit more technical. But my final words, especially in regards to Gatsby being upgraded from version 2 to version 3, is that I believe they're starting to address some of the issues that I address on this slide, where everything sounds fantastic, but naturally that lift has to go somewhere. Because we built a lot of the systems, they're all documented in a separate repo called community-portal, where there's probably 200 or so PRs with Charles Dickens worth sleuth of information. But the lift is that Gatsby has been notoriously known for having really bloated build times. That means if you're using a CI/CD process like Netlify, it will cost you more as you use it more. The more content you add, the slower the build times are. It's an unfortunate fact, but at the end of the day, the website is free, so the cost has to go somewhere. Okay, so let's get into some code real quick, starting with what this directory actually looks like. And I think it would look better if I just go to GitHub. So let's go to GitHub community. Let's just look at the folder structure here because it's a lot more beautiful. So prior, we had a separate repo that this project was initialized in called community-portal. It didn't contain certain files that are here. We ended up merging that repo into the main community repo at large. So it's a little bit of a mono repo. It solves multiple problems, but its structure is still having our Gatsby project at the top. And then there are a couple of other really required directories that are used by other projects in the community. Specifically things like if you see like contributing, FAQs, content, well, not content, governance, grants, hackathons, meetups, onboarding. A lot of these directories are managed by Long for Wisdom, and the data that go inside of them, they're also markdown files from what I've noticed, are used by certain procedures in our community and on the chain as well. So those are dangerous files. We don't touch those. We don't have to be concerned about those. A lot of our project is kind of contained within a vacuum, which is the beauty of the GraphQL system that Gatsby enables us to use. But let me open up a couple of links, starting with source and content. So source directory, if you're not a developer, don't be afraid. This is kind of where all of our code for the project lives. We have a Gatsby plugin theme UI folder here. This is where we will define things like our prism colors and all the other like SVG imports, things like colors get defined here. And if we have existing themes, which we do, we're implementing, I believe, the Maker Nuo, or the new Maker theme that they have on the theme UI. And they have a package of colors, and we'll just make sure to inject that into our dictionaries for colors and other things that we start to define here. But we also have a components.js file, which you'll see has something called an MD override. The beautiful thing about Mdxjs is that not only does it allow you, well, we already know, I've said this 100 times, but the interlacing of Markdown and React, but it also enables us to create our own components. And this is where they get defined. You might think it's a little weird that they're sitting in this Gatsby plugin theme UI folder, but Gatsby plugin theme UI has a little bit of a connection with Mdxjs that kind of enables them to just pull our components and inject them into the context provider that Mdx provides to the project. So you'll see things like we'll have like basic definitions like an anchor link, or we'll have a custom link component for that, or something like a table or a divider will have custom components because we have custom styles. What else do we have? Right. We actually have custom components that go outside of the scope and limits of just the markdown elements, because all of these, like a link, an image, H1, H2, these are all comparable. These are all comparable to the tools that are available to you when you're writing in Markdown. But when we start to want to extend that, that's where our custom components come in. You'll see this giant object of components that we've written as tools for our community, things like a status banner or an aligner to kind of fix alignment of images, an accordion component, things that aren't generally available in Markdown. This is kind of where we get to extend that. Things like videos, like you can't really put a good video component inside of Markdown and hope and expect it to render. And then we just export those, and they get imported through Gatsby plugin theme UI. The next folder we have is a modules folder, and this directory is essentially designed based on the context of the concern of a component. So if you're working specifically with authors, you would look in the authors module, and that will have its own piece of information. And God bless to Antonio for helping to clean this up for me, where we now have our components. We have data functions and methods, and any transformers to existing data kind of situated in their own contextual directories as well. This is, this is all design stuff. This is all like for the benefit of the developers that are going to be working on this project. And then naturally any other types, we're using Flow from what I know. And that enables us to kind of type out, not type out, but typing of our code without the use of TypeScript. And let's see. Oh, right. Actually, that's a really good thing I should mention. This project is written using vanilla JavaScript. We're not using TypeScript with Gatsby, particularly because the focus for this project is to ensure that we have the velocity we need to get things done. I'm very much a let's just get the job done first kind of developer, because there won't be any code to refactor or clean if the project isn't finished. So that's why we're doing all the nice typing stuff now. But naturally, all these other modules, they're very specifically tied to things that we would want to focus on. And before I dive deeper into these modules, we have the pages directory, which is a directory expected by Gatsby for the different pages of our site. These aren't the pages that are created by content creators, so we'll get to that. But essentially, the most important pages here, naturally, is the index page, which is just, you go to community-portal.com. This is the page that you will land on, but you won't actually see it. And to show you that, let's go just to slash, right? So you see a little blank page, and then it drops you into EN. That's a little bit of an example of our translation module at work. And that's because, oh wait, I gotta go to, that's because this page serves solely to redirect our users based on the locale of their browser. So in the case that we have a locale that is supported, like if ES or GM or JP exists on our site, we can direct those users correctly to their locale based on the information we can gather from their browser. So yeah, that's just a navigate to our initial locale. And another thing about initial locales is that the project has a default locale. And in that case, in the case of our portal, that default locale is EN for English. Excuse me. That default locale is English. And it's important to have that default locale because it acts as a fallback in the case that other languages don't exist. And we'll dive much deeper into that once we start talking about some of the auto magic that is happening to generate our site. But you've probably heard me say a lot of things like, oh, what you see is what you get. And the content creators essentially control the website. That means every single page, this homepage, this learn page, all of it is written in MDX, and these pages exist inside of the content directory. So at the top level of our project, we have a content directory. And inside of that, you'll see, you can ignore the all contributors.json. That's a little bit more extra. We'll get to that at the end, possibly. But you'll see that we have EN, and then you'll see that we have an index.mdx. Let's go into that, and we'll see, let me look at the raw for this. You'll see that we have markdown with a couple of front matter parameters. But this is the markdown and React being interwoven to create the page that we have here on the home page. Like if we were to look for this welcome to community development, we can find that here. It's just an H2 and markdown, but it is surrounded by a component we call a box, which kind of does a little bit of styling and formatting for the view. And, you know, you can say, I want to do something else like hello. Oops. This H3 will then render just below this piece of information here if I was running this locally. So that's all well and good. However, you'll notice that the organization of this directory looks a little funky. And that's because of two things. First, I want to ensure that the content directory solves one of our mission objectives of being obvious when you look at it. So the slugs should match the directory. The other is that we are using Gatsby page creator. And if I'll just open that here. Where's my Gatsby config? We are using plugin page creator. And what this plugin does for us is it looks for a path. In this case, it's looking for the content directory at the top level of our project. And we have a couple of ignore patterns to make sure that if anybody puts anything that they shouldn't be putting in this directory, it just gets ignored. Like don't create a PowerPoint page, please. Like, you know, I wouldn't do that. I'm sure you wouldn't do that, but you never know. folks may not be as versed yet, especially if they're just joining the community and adding content. They won't know like, oh, where do I put images, or, oh, where do I put this PowerPoint I want to link to, right? Like they just won't know these things. So making sure that we can prepare for those cases ahead of time is super important. But this little thing is the thing that creates all of our pages based on the MDX pages that exist. However, we also are using plugin MDX. We're using Gatsby plugin MDX, which enables us to use MDX with Gatsby. It looks for two extensions, .mdx and regular .md files. So like if somebody has an existing markdown file somewhere and they just want to slap it in and not use any of our components, they totally can do that and it will render just fine. And we have a couple of default layouts. You could ignore the blog post one because that's a little bit more newer and I probably won't cover that for this call. But the default layout, they're essentially kind of the same. They act as the layout wrapper for the page. So let's go to that. Let's go to default layout.js real quick. You'll see a couple of really scary looking objects wrapped in quotes. These are our GraphQL queries. Specifically, we are running this really disgusting regex call to ensure that we are getting all of the file absolute paths for all the MDX files in our project out of the content directory. And this little // with the 2 is ensuring that we are getting all the files out of the locale that we need. And all of these is just ignore all these kinds of files, right? Like we're just making sure that another double check, just making sure nobody's putting anything they shouldn't be putting in this directory. I know we're getting a couple of pieces of data out of that though, right? We're getting the node, which will contain our headings. We get the first H1, we get its absolute path. So the actual path it has on our directory locally, to the file itself. So if I was to output this, you'll see something like Rejon /community /content /en /whatever on our web server or anywhere you may deploy this. It'll essentially follow that path depending on wherever it's being used. Then we're also pulling out some front matter, specifically the title and the order. And this is where I'll get into this a little bit after I explain this page more, because that's when we start digging deeper into the more advanced concepts of this project and the auto magic of it all. So let's skip some of this code. But a lot of this code is essentially just rendering a fragment, and it renders a side nav based on some rules that we have. It provides the SEO from the page. The important part about this default layout and the fact that it's being used here from the Gatsby plugin MDX is that whenever the page creator plugin says, okay, I've got this MDX page from the content directory, I'm going to take that page and then I'm going to pass it to the Gatsby plugin MDX, and the Gatsby plugin MDX is going to be like, okay, what kind of file are we dealing with? Where is this file located? It's located inside a it's not defined. Okay, go with the default. And the default in this case is default layout. Blog posts matches the directory name for where our blog posts are located. So those things are super important. This is how it knows that, oh, it's a blog post MDX file. But essentially we get this layout, it goes in and it passes the data from that MDX file in. So if we were to look at the en/index, index MDX real quick, you'll see this front matter. This front matter is really just like extraneous details and information about a page that you would want to be recognized, whether that be through SEO or if you want to have more modular control over the elements that show up in the layout. You'll see things like here, like, oh, hide the breadcrumbs component or hide the scroll CTA. You can even do things like hide the side nav if you didn't want a side nav on your page. this kind of granular control essentially means that a writer or anybody adding content to the site could say, oh, on my page specifically, I don't want to show this element. How could I hide this element? Well, if it's part of the default layout, which it most likely will be, you can just add a new Boolean parameter to your front matter. We'll take that, recognize it, and hide that thing from the UI. However, where does the actual MDX go, right? Like where does all of this below actually go? And that goes inside this thing here where it says children, because the children prop of the default layout is the MDX that has been converted into React code that then gets displayed on our website. That's actually really the coolest part about MDX for me, is that they take the markdown and the React, and then they just, at the end of the day, turn it into React code that then gets displayed on our user interfaces. So that's the default layout. That's how the pages are made. That's, writing a page is as simple as going into the content directory, going into your locale and just saying hello.mdx and hello. That's about it. Save that, push it, and boom, you go to /hello, /en/hello, you'll see hello YouTube. And that is like the shortest path to creating a page on our site, no matter what page that may be. It could be a blog post, it could be a content post, it could be the home page, it could be any page. And that is how the sausage is made. All right, let's take a little breather real quick. Let's ease off on the heavy technical stuff. Let's talk about something cool. Let's talk about something exciting. Let's go through a couple of pages. So I tricked you. We're not actually easing off of the technical talk. We're going a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the header and let's talk about the side nav, because these are probably the most complex parts of our site at all. Essentially, the header and the side nav are automatically generated based on the files that exist in our content directories. So if this page die, for example, if this die index page didn't exist, you would not see it here. The other important thing about the header, though, is that all of these pages have been kind of designed by our content creators to exist in a header. So you'll see things like, if we go to, let's go to the learn index page real quick, you'll see this parameter here called header true, and you'll see its header order position, with 0 being first in the line left to right, is 0. You can set this parameter on any page of our website. You want something to be in a header, like, I don't know, let's go to this page here. You say header true, you save that, you push it, and I'm not doing this locally because it would be too slow, but if you were working with this locally, you had hot reloading going, you would see your header updated with that page that you wanted. That's as easy as it is for a writer to update the header of the website without having to figure out where the component is, figure out where the links are, and how to copy and paste things. It's as simple as adding this. Now, it's simple to do, but executing it is a completely different story from a technical standpoint, because we have multiple concerns. The first is that we have to kind of assume everybody's going to make a mistake. The second is that our entire website is localized freely, like as in, if you wanted to create a fake language and have that be the language you use for all the content on the website, you totally can without restriction. And the third is that between locales, there will be files that do exist and files that don't exist. You can't expect the Spanish community development website, for example, to have all of the pages that the English one does, especially since there may be different kinds of articles that that community specifically want to talk about or want to solve for. So with that in mind, how do we solve kind of it's an algorithms problem essentially, where we have to figure out, the first thing is like getting the data, getting the pages. And this is kind of where our build process gets a little bit expensive for increasing that time. Because if we go back to the default layout and look at this little scary blob of GraphQL code real quick, we'll see that I'm running a query called get MDX data. And I'm specifically tagging the all MDX content blob that Gatsby will generate for us. And then I'm running a filter specifically on the file absolute path to get us the content, and any content page that exists within a locale. So in this specific case, any pages outside of the locale aren't considered for the side nav and for the header. If you wanted this, it's as easy as just bada bing, bada boom. You get rid of that, then boom, you're getting all the data for all your pages in the content directory. But because we are localization focused, and we kind of make sure that solving for locales and solving for internationalization, especially from an accessibility standpoint, is always solved first. That means there isn't a consideration being made by stakeholders at, oh, we think it might be too hard to add Germany, or it might be hard to add Arabic. And it's like, no. You just need somebody to create the content for you. So there is no limitations in regards to your localization. That's always has to come first. And I'm a very big accessibility advocate in that regard. However, politics aside, the data that we're grabbing, again, is we're going through an array of edges. We're grabbing the node. And in this context for the default layout, we're grabbing the first header, we're grabbing the absolute path, and from our front matter, we're looking for the title and its order parameter. And a way that's used is, where did I put it? Where am I using OMDX? Let's crawl through this real quick. Yes, here it is. So this calculate tree data method is the most important method in regards to the automatic generation of our side nav. If we were to go look at this, it is quite hefty. We are looking at about 200 and something lines of code specifically for an algorithm to solve for every single edge case, for every single locale possibility for any page on our website, regardless of how it's spelt or where it came from. So I've written a ton of documentation here, and I'm probably just going to read it back. It takes the MDX edge data, constructs a usable side nav object that we will use throughout the site code. And it creates side nav objects specifically for our default language and our current locale. This is a very important thing to notice about this algorithm. It would be much simpler if we could just be like, for our current language, process everything. But there was a design requirement raised during the summer where we were like, okay, well, if this page doesn't exist in Spanish, but it exists in English, should we have the English page exist in its place? Kind of like a fallback page of sorts. And the answer was yes. So we have to take both the English or our default locale, and we also have to take whatever our current language is and combine those two into a usable data package. In the case that if I was on ES, for example, and I were to get rid of die, this page would exist in English in this side nav bar. And then we also make sure that we merge some of the overlaps. So we take all the pages for Spanish and all the pages for English, and then we merge those and get rid of anything. If Spanish is our locale, we get rid of anything from the English directory and sort that out and keep anything that does exist from the English directory, just to make sure that we're doing that little merge and making sure that we still have the fallback languages and pages. Part of this solution, I actually borrowed from Hasura's Gatsby Gitbook starter, ironically. We're using a Gitbook solution to kind of solve for this. They wrote a side nav reducer, and let me link this in the chat for folks. But it's it's a little bit of a carbon copy of what they created, except I've tweaked it to kind of meet our needs, especially given that our data is different. And well, the data input is different and the data output needs to be different as well, because this algorithm doesn't just solve for the side nav, it also solves for the breadcrumbs because they have different needs for their data as well. And instead of having two methods, calculate side nav data and calculate breadcrumb data, which would essentially pull its data and information from the same pool, just get it all done in one method. So let's walk through this a little bit. We are taking in our edges. So that's the thing we're getting from that GraphQL call. It's just an array of objects that contain our blog posts or our content page posts. We have a current top section, and that is, at least based on the design of our content by Ryan past summer, it's based on the top sections of your header. So like things like learn, contribute, funding, it's any directory that sits at the top of your EN folder. So if contribute is a directory, FAQs is a directory, funding, learn, and resources, these are all current top sections. It's only designed this way to really solve for the need of each of these top sections has their own side nav. It's not like, oh, we have one entire content directory, we have one side nav. If I were to go to contribute, you'll see that this has a completely different side nav. And this is a very unique approach, I think, to our content solution for the portal. It's not really something I think would be used more at large. But in the case that you have a giant collection of data and a giant collection of knowledge that you wanted to then each have their own side nav with their own breadcrumb data as well, this is how we had to kind of do it, where the contribute page goes to the default layout, right? Just to run it from the top. We come to this contribute page, we land on this bit of code here. It runs the query. It's already run the query. The query, it's a static query. It gets run during build time. So all we are actually using here is just a giant blob of data. That data then transpiles down into the calculate tree, where we pass in the edges that get returned from this query. We also make sure, we also make sure that we are passing in the top section. And the way that we grab that is by taking the current page's path, replacing all the garbage, splitting it by its slashes, and taking and slicing it by 1. So we're taking kind of the second index of this URL. Like if we were to take this, we know that we're going to have a locale, get rid of the locale, take this, contribute. That is your top section. And because of our rule of what you see is what you get with the file content structure and the way that the Gatsby plugin page creator works by using the names of the files and the names of the folder, we can 100% ensure, guaranteed, that the name of the file will always match the name in the slug. And that's why we pull out file absolute path. Next, we pass in our default locale, which goes into the localization and translation module, but I'll cover that a little bit later. Take our current locale and the pathers, which is just every single part of your string after en gets chopped and put into an array. So if I was on, let's go deep. If I was on guide to hacking, we will take we'll take guide to hacking, we'll take hackathons, we'll take contribute, and those are our path directories. All of that gets passed into the calculate tree data algorithm. And the first thing we do is filter through our edges to make sure that we're getting only the current top section. So if I'm in contribute, I don't need the data from learn. I don't need the data from funding. I don't need the data from anywhere else. Just get me the top section. So we filter that all out. And we also have to make sure that we're getting the base file too, because that's another complication of our content structure, where if I were to click on content, there is a chance that the directory for content will have an index.mdx, which acts as its home page, and some of them won't. So just another thing we have to solve for, like another edge case where it's like somebody may create a folder. Let me see, where's my content? Like if I were to create a new folder called cool things to do, and then I immediately created a page called skateboarding.mdx, or yeah, I'll just leave that for now. But if I were to create this page, this directory would exist in, well, if I were to like throw it in FAQs, this directory would exist as a part of the side nav because we have the little title system to ensure that we always have a really clean string for our side nav. But when you click on this, it won't take you to index.mdx. It'll take you to the first file in its list, in this case, which is skateboarding.mdx. However, if we were to add a, let me bring this up so y'all can see. If we were to add an index.mdx and then throw that in, then clicking on cool things to do would take you to its homepage. However, we also have to make sure that we can code and solve. Our algorithm should be able to kind of solve for both of these cases. So ensuring that we have the current top section and that the file absolute path of this page isn't, well, let me see. Yeah, making sure that it has the current top section and that it has an index.mdx. I take all of that and I flatten that map. I'm using a flat map here. And what that does is it just takes, because these are just all objects, we need to be able to kind of pull out just the things we need from it. And I make sure to simplify our object to meet our needs. So the first thing I do is I'm building out the slug for this page. So that way, when you click a link, it's just like, give me the slug for this page instead of a developer having to kind of recreate that. Then we have the raw slug, which is just the slug with, like the regular slug is the page with its name. And because actually, let me just give an example, right? Let me type it out for you. So we have content /en. Well, we have a lot more than that. We have Rejon /community /content /en/FAQs /cool things to do /skateboarding .mdx. And what we have to do is to get a regular slug, in our case, we know that we just want this. We just want this. So the first thing we do is we find the index of the current locale. We get its length. We take the length of our entire string and we slice it from here all the way to here. So we're dropping all that extra piece of information that'll come from our server or locally. Then we replace the MDX with nothing. We just drop the MDX. In the case that we're using an index page, like index.mdx, we just drop this because we know that in the browser, slash is the index. And then we make sure to get rid of any other garbage, so any spaces or anything like that. And our raw slug is going to take that and it's going to drop the locale. So in the case of this slug, which contains en/FAQ/ whatever, the raw slug just drops the en, so it'll just be FAQs/ whatever. And the reason why we do this is because we need to be able to compare. There are certain situations where we'll need to be able to compare pages based on their existence in the locale. If a page exists and they both share the same name, we have a component called a language selector that can show up on any page. And if you click that, it'll show you a list of all the other locales that this page exists for. This is just another means of solving for that. Finally, we have a little something called the title rule, where we will take a page and its title, or rather, the title that shows up here, the title that shows up in the side nav, the title that shows up in SEO or anywhere else is based on a few rules. The first is that if a writer has determined the title of a page inside of front matter, so that little up here, this title here, for example, is the title of this page, we take it first. That is the title. Then we spell down. We check if the data for this page, we get its headings. Does it have any headings? It does? Okay, get the first heading. And we only check the H1. If you remember our GraphQL query here, we only get a depth of H1. The first H1 is the next kind of spill down for the title. If that doesn't exist, then just take the slug part, which in this case is just the file name of the file. So if we were looking at cool things to do, skateboarding would be the slug part here. So a little more example into the title rule. I've written extensively about this, but like if there's front matter, then the title will be something like skateboarding in your front matter, unless your first H1 is cool things to do, things Tony Hawk, then the title of your page and the title on your SEO will be cool things Tony Hawk, if this skateboarding doesn't exist. So if this front matter skateboarding doesn't exist, then it's going to be cool things Tony Hawk. Now, if cool things Tony Hawk doesn't exist, then we just take the file name and use that as the title. We just constantly spill down until we get to like the final denominator of a page existing. And thankfully, because every single page should have a file name, we can at least consistently know that a title will exist. And finally, we return all of that. We return the title, the slug, the raw slug, the slug part, and its order. And the order is an important parameter because writers will want to control the order that these pages show up on the sidebar. This was a big request during the middle of the summer, where certain pages initially were being categorized by alphabetical order, but sometimes that's not always the case that you want based on the design of the content you're presenting. You may want, what's a good example? Yeah, you may want something like your learn page to first show the name of your company. And if it starts with a Z and it's all the way at the bottom of your side nav, then that's not exactly going to solve for anything you need to do. In our case, we say, okay, you want to control the order, you pass us an order property inside of your front matter with the lowest number being at the top and the highest number being at the bottom. If no order exists, then we start to sort based on the title's alphabetical order. So in the case of this MakerDAO index page, let's go to MakerDAO. Oh, actually, no, this is learn. Index, here we go. We see here that it has an order of -5. It is probably the lowest order based on its title. It'll show up at the top. Another important thing, and the reason why this giant calculate tree is so giant is that we also have to be able to solve for situations where we have files inside of directories and directories inside of directories, and with files inside of directories. We kind of have to be able to support the flexibility of the file directory regardless of whatever the structure of it may be. So in the case of something complicated like if I were to go to this borrow die page, then we see that the slug is learn/die/get die borrow die. How the way the order prop works is based on the context in which the level it exists in the side nav is. So in the case of this buy die, earn die, borrow die, if I wanted borrow die to be the first in this list, I would set its order to 0 or a negative number or negative infinity. However, you'll never be able to take borrowed I and put it at the top of the side nav here. That's not something you can do because that goes against our what you see is what you get philosophy. That means that a file that is actually 1, 2, 3, 4 levels deep in your directory is at the top. And now when somebody has to go look for that file, they won't exactly know where to look. The other is just that from an engineering perspective, it would be way too much work to support that and all of the other stuff we're supporting already. So you kind of have to compromise and say, okay, you can only contextually handle order based on the location or the depth that it exists at. You can't take a file from here and throw it at the top of the side nav. That's just not something we will support. However, to continue talking about this algorithm a little bit more, we make all the side nav objects. That's just a method to run that. But the actual method happens here. We say, okay, the default locale files, make our side nav objects, we pass in the edges, and we use our default locale. Then we create an array based on our current locale. But only if your default locale is your current locale, then we don't run this twice. Like that would just be unnecessary. Just pass an empty array. And then finally, we say, okay, our editable locale files, which is kind of just this stretched out current locales file. This is probably extraneous, but it works for now. We take that and we merge those files. We say, okay, if current locale files has a length of 0, and in our case, that means our default locale is our current locale, then just our merged locale files is just the default. We ain't got to do a merge, right? That's fine. If it is a merge, then we take the default locales files, we map through all of them, and we say, okay, find the localized file from our current locale files. We're going to find, we look for the file match based on the raw slug because it's more consistent, without having to do like, oh, is it this locale or this locale? Like if you have 10 locales or 20 locales, nobody wants to search through 20 locales. Just give me the raw slug. And if those slugs match without their locales, then we're good to go. We found a merge. So if there's a file match, we just splice that out of the editable locale files. Else we just continue that map, just keep going. Finally, outside of this find, well, that's just a find. Oops, that's just a find. Outside of that, we then say, okay, if we found a localized file to merge overlap, then return that file. Return the file from the locale that we need, right? Like this is how we're doing the merge. We say, okay, we found the localized file for our current locale. Take that and swap it out with the default locale. Just get rid of it. And then we concatenate all those files together, which is great. The next part we have is in regards to breadcrumb data, which you think would be really easy, considering there's even a plugin to solve for this. There's a Gatsby breadcrumb plugin, but it wasn't as extensible for our needs that we needed. So instead, I just decided to combine the concerns into one algorithm where we just say, okay, we have a current top section, then we have breadcrumb data. Essentially, we say, okay, inside of that, and the reason why this rule exists really quickly, real quick segues, because if you go to a homepage, homepages don't have breadcrumbs. We don't have to worry about that, right? Like we don't have to go to a learn page. Like all the top level index files for like contribute and funding, none of them have breadcrumbs, and that's by design. So our algorithm does not support it. But you do have a current top section, and you're not the index file of that current top section, and bada bing, bada boom, we have an array here. We take this, we say your part is your current top section. Your title is using the title rule where we take your current top section, return that. Well, this is really just like initializing the object, right? We say, oh, you have a current top section, then your first index after home will always be the top section. It'll always be learn. Like if we go in here, we say, okay, the first instance will always be learn. We don't have to worry about that. And that URL for this link specifically will always be the current top section index page, because we know that has to exist based on the design of the content. Then we have a reducer that essentially takes our merged locale files and reduces them. It goes through, it says, okay, based on, and this is kind of where we start to dive into the territory of Husserl's algorithm. We go through all those, we take the part of our raw slug. So we say we split that raw slug, we split FAQs / cool things / Tony Hawk. And we essentially have an array, right, of strings. That's FAQ, thing, and Tony Hawk. We take that, we slice it by its first and its last. So -1 for a slice is always going to be the last element at the end of the array. We have our sliced parts. Fantastic. We loop through those sliced parts and we say our TMP, or like temporary, is if we have previous items from our accumulator, we use, which should be an array, right? Items, previous items, it should be an array of the items that we have reduced so far by accumulating at the end of this reducer. We find if in our previous items array, we find if the slug part for this page exists. So in the case of MakerDAO, the slug part is MakerDAO. It's the name of the file in our URL. We say, okay, if we found something, and if our temp.items doesn't exist, then we set our temp.items to an empty array. We're essentially at the start of a side nav, and it's much harder to actually talk about this code without visualizing it. So let me put this side nav on the side. What this algorithm is doing, and the reason why we're doing it this way, is because it enables us to prepare for that case where we will have an infinite amount of depth to our content directory. We don't know if a writer or an editor is going to make a folder with 20 folders and the depth is infinity. To be able to support that, we essentially slice each part or each file name. We take that and we say, okay, is this a header? Does it have children? MakerDAO in this case has children. So we say, okay, you got children. We're gonna go through your children and handle their depth. So in this case, let's go to die and get die. Die has children. Get die has children. So we say, okay, once we reach get die in the slug part for our reducer, we say, okay, we're going to handle your children. And if those children have children, then we're going to handle those children. It's kind of like a mafia contract of sorts. We're going through and running through each page and handling its, routing, essentially, where it shows up in our side nav and the link to it in relation to where it shows up on our side nav. So yeah, I've written extensively about this code, but to keep things moving forward, because we're definitely over the hour mark, it runs through, it sorts everything by the order, if the order exists. If not, then we do a locale compare, and this is very important instead of like an actual string compare, because string compares do it based on Latin characters. But in the case that we have Arabic or Russian for any of our languages, using locale compare is better supported for whether a title is closer to A than Z kind of situation. And that's how order is handled. And we return that as side nav data and breadcrumb data. That was a lot.
Yeah, it's actually probably a good point for Andy to ask any questions. We have our special illustrious guests from the the metaverse of crypto wandering, also stopped by while we were developing this last summer. So we invited him for this call. If you want to ask any questions, Andy, you can absolutely go for it. Floor is yours.
I mean, after all of that, I don't have any questions about how tree data is calculated, because it's all clear and very well documented. I am in awe of the flexibility that this provides and the infinite depth that you can handle. I agree with the way that it's structured. I'm using it in my own projects. I look forward to being able to show you what those entail and continuing the discussion. The only part of the discussion that I can usefully add to is earlier on in the slides when you presented the ongoing conversation parts. Where do we go from here is perhaps I have some ideas on that front. But in terms of this particular tool building and engineering aspect, it's been exceptionally well done, and it's been a breeze to import an entirely new and different site into the same framework. The proof of it is in a public Git repo, which I will add in the chat and you can put in the show notes just to give a little bit more icing on the cake of this incredible build.
Thank you, Chi. That means a lot. I'm really happy it's working out. It's a beast, and a lot of folks will be like, well, this package does this package does that, right? Like, oh, why don't you just install INT NL for your localization and stuff like that, right? And it was very much like the problem with the practice of using packages like that, right? Like if it solves your case, it solves your case, but we have a very unique, different case, at least for the portal specifically. And there are definitely much simpler solutions these days that I've seen that has come out after we finished the portal. But the reason for our approach with most of our code is really like packages come with the whole jungle, and we just needed the banana, right? Like we just needed the one thing out of that package that does it really, really, really well, instead of the entire library. Like we just needed the book. So my approach for this project was very much like, if I find an opportunity where our stakeholders are asking me for the entire world and I want to give it to them, I will most likely have to build it myself. However, because of the modularity of the data system and the modularity of the GraphQL plugins, it's kind of like you get to mix and match the features that you need. Like if we were to look at the config file again.
I do, just before you go to the config file, I do actually have one question about this tree data file.
Oh yeah,
and that is that's on mobile navigation for documentation sites in particular, it's really useful to have next and previous buttons at the bottom of a page, because currently on mobile, you will need to go back into the hamburger menu, remember where you are, remember what depth it is, and it gets difficult to navigate on mobile. Whereas if you have next and previous buttons that navigate from one page to the next based on the order specified in the front matter, that makes mobile nav in particular significantly easier. How would you go about implementing that in this file?
Absolutely. So that's, I think, one of my favorite parts about the way that this algorithm is written. Like it's 200 lines, because that is all the 200 lines you're going to need, right? The side nav data, the side nav data gets sorted and ordered at the end of this algorithm here. So when you look at side nav data, you actually have an array in the order that you need it for the pages that you want. So you could go to, let's say, your default layout, and let's say side nav data has to be here somewhere. So we have side nav data, we pass that into a side nav component. Because this side nav data is just an array of objects with slugs and titles, and those get mapped through in the order they're provided, your use case on mobile would be that for inside of your default layout, let's say you have, let me just make a quick thing, right? Let's say you have a div, and let's say, actually, let's go inside the side nav, because I think I actually do some of that here. Side nav node. So let's say like a node is your page. They're essentially synonymous with each other. If I wanted to create a next button, I would just do something like div next. Actually, no, I'll just make it a link. Link. And then 2 equals yada, yada, yada. And let's say that in this case, I'm not passing the next child, but let's say that I wanted to say next sibling in the list is something like data items index -1. And of course, you would have to make sure that you're supporting the edge cases of whether you're at the beginning or end of an array. But let's say like my next sibling is this item. I can pass that in, knowing full well what my next sibling is. But the complication, I think, for your use case will come from the depth of the pages. So in the case where we have something like borrow die, if I hit, or even better, let's say I'm on buy die and I hit previous, I would expect that to take me to get die. However, because it's a parent and not a sibling, it may not know about its parent. So you have a little bit of tweaking you need to do to the algorithm to kind of support that. Like let's say we wanted to do, actually, no, we want to update the side nav data itself. So I would look at the make side navs function specifically. And because this is where we are like outputting our data, you would probably want something like next, and you would say based on the data provided from this flat map, you check, oh, if let's say flat map, I should be able to get like an index out of this flat map. And then based on its index, you would essentially want to check like if you have a sibling, if not, get the next from the previous data slide. At least that's what my approach would be. My approach would definitely be to like update the side nav data objects to support next and previous, so that way you have those pages as part of your current pages side nav data. And then when you click next, the only thing you need to see is like, oh, give me the slug from my next sibling object, and then it would take me to that page, because you can't really always predict what page that would be. At least that's what my initial off the top of my head approach would be, especially given I remember you asking for that last summer. We didn't get to execute it. But part of this is that because you can always trust that the side nav data will be in the correct order when you output it, you might even want to set up like things like what my next sibling is around here when we actually perform the sort. There's multiple ways to really skin this cat. But I do think you also proposed a really good question in regards to how we're handling mobile navigation, because mobile is also its own kind of side nav that has unique design constraints. Have it yet. So we have a mobile nav. It also takes the side nav data. If we were to look at that mobile nav, we're doing some minor algorithmic things to really just handle the UI states, but really just checking. This was like a hack for blog data, but like checking like, oh, do I have items? What is my current slug part? Because some of the design constraints was like, oh, if I'm on the learn page, then when I open the mobile nav, I should be here. I should be on this learn. I should see the side nav open as I would see it on desktop. And then I should be able to click this back menu and I should see that learn is bold. So there's like, different needs for understanding the context of what page you're on mobile. But you could have, like, at least the way that we solve it for now is by mimicking the side nav data on mobile. But a next and previous button would just be to update the output of the data from the side nav in the calculate tree data, somewhere around where the sort occurs or somewhere around where the side nav objects are made. That's my initial thought. Or, if you want to handle it outside of the algorithm, you can handle that wherever your side nav data is being passed in and mapped. You could use this kind of prop.
Amazing. I'm going to apologize to the people on the call because I'm just such a sucker for Rejon Radio, and ask another question to do with not just mobile navigation, but sort of Web3 inclusion. One of the things that I am wanting to do is extend some of the educational capacities of the sites with some spaced repetition memory systems, which will require a database and the ability to connect to a person's accounts. Connecting to a person's account can be fairly easily done with some JS libraries and other components, but spaced repetition requires a database. And I see in the top level structure that there is a Gatsby SSR file, but you're not using that at the moment correctly because this is for a static sites. How much work do you think it would be to implement a very, very simple database, just literally for email notifications using that SSR file?
Using the SSR file. It's complicated because depending on the library you choose will kind of determine, like, there's kind of two issues here, right? Like the first is that Gatsby has kind of its own enclosed library of plugins that work really well with its build processes that touch the SSR files and touch the node files and kind of does all these things automatically for you. I'm not entirely sure if they have one for Web3. We didn't really explore that for the portal. But, you know, because it's a React project, you could probably work with any Web3 React library that would essentially allow you to hook into that information. I think it's really where you use it. In the case of things like with the Gatsby SSR here, we're only really using it to ensure that during build time, that the translation provider and all the other contexts is like similarly to Gatsby browser, we kind of just mimic these two. But for your use case, I think a really good approach could be to, I don't know. I honestly, I don't really have a hard answer on that, only because it definitely comes down to the library you choose to handle that connection. And I guess my next question for you is like, would you want Gatsby to be your database? Like, do you imagine that your content is the database that they'll be pulling from, or is the database going to be somewhere else?
No, I have great flexibility with data. I mean, ideally, I would want everything to remain static forever. But because what I really want to do is, you know, with a huge amount of content, one of the great ways of getting people to memorize it is with flashcards that present questions and answers and are done in a spaced, repetitive manner. In order to handle that, one requires a database which people would sign up to and give their email address, so that they can be notified to come back to the site in a week, and then in 2 weeks, and then in a month, and then in 2 months, in order to review the content. So the database has got nothing to do with the content. It's literally just tiny email signups and the time that person signed up, and if they answered the question correctly, so that it can send them a notification.
Gotcha. Yeah,
very simple.
Yeah, I think that's totally possible with this system at all. Especially given that this system is more geared for working with your content than it is working with like extraneous means of pulling data outside of the system. So like it can be a purely static site where you have instances of dynamically gathering data or making post requests for those kinds of emails. Like I'm not suggesting any technologies, but if you wanted to use something like MailChimp, you can totally integrate MailChimp on your Gatsby project. They actually have a MailChimp plugin specifically, and then you should be able to configure that in your config file to meet your needs. But really, with this being a React project, I would say sky is the limit. If it works in React, you can use anything.
Cool.
Sweet.
I have a very, very quick question regarding blog page. Now that we have this page blog, the module blog is we are not using it, right?
Let me see.
Because I was refactoring this code inside modules blog. Yeah, modules blog. We are not using any of these. I don't know. I mean, yes, we are using blog result, like we're using the components, but now the page, we are not using the blog home for sure, because
Right.
the blog home now, I just want to make sure about that. So I can, maybe I will move all this code, I will move it to the page.
Yeah. That I would say that's totally fine. I don't have any holds barred, especially given that I'm leaving. So
Yeah, no, I just want to make sure that we have duplicated code here, like the blog home we are using now in the blog inside pages.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the main like home for blog is the blog post layout. So if it's being used here or it's being used by, it doesn't really matter about the other, because we have like two pools of data. We have the content that handles all the other pages, and then we have a new blog, which has a separated bucket of data here on the outside. Just blog posts follows the same locale format. But these pages are all like equally living in a vacuum. So these absolutely don't really matter in the context of those components, unless there's things like, I would say like the blog post layout is using every single component from that module. So if you want to move that around, I've got no problems with that. I think the only other place we're probably using the blog results is in search results, because they have blog search results in that, which should be going out by the end of this week for sure. But other than that, did I answer your question? I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. He was just asking about the specific module files to refactor some code. I think he did.
Yeah.
And with
awesome.
that, all questions have been answered, at least for now. And then regardless, there's plenty of documentation. You can find it on our GitHub. So thanks everybody for coming. I'm gonna stop this.